Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Talking again about the English Bill of Rights and how they helped shape the U.S. Bill of Rights. And once again, we have one of our favorites, Dr. Beienberg, here to kind of help us understand. Dr. Beienberg, how did it shape the U.S. Bill of Rights?
So it shaped the Bill of Rights, I would actually say, more indirectly than many people think. So one of the themes that we've talked about in other parts of the podcast is that the Americans and the British took very, very different lessons from the English Bill, from the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and 1689. So two of the products of that are obviously John Locke's writings, and the English Bill of Rights is another. And as we talk, just as a brief sort of kind of connection to that, remember the Americans understand the Glorious Revolution to be fundamentally guarantee of both substantive sets of rights as well as a sort of establishment of local government. And that the British understand the legacy of the Glorious Revolution to be one about a strong parliament. And that really plays out as you look through the English Bill of Rights. Now, when we think of the U.S. Bill of Rights today, it's very much a focus on the first 8 and the idea of this as a set of individual rights. But in many ways, the English Bill of Rights is actually closer to a separation of powers document. And that's clear from the very beginning. If you look at the first sorts of protests that it makes, which then the English Bill of Rights is sort of redundant, where it has a list of count 1, count 2, count 3, count 4, things that James II has been doing, and then and therefore, and then there's a list of sort of rights or guarantees that the new English monarchs, William and Mary, agree to. Mary being, again, the daughter of the deposed British king and her husband, William, who is effectively, he's got a strange title, but it's effectively a sort of quasi-hereditary governor of the Netherlands. But they basically take over in England as a condition of that, they agree to this English Bill of Rights that has been given to them by Parliament. So some of the objections that are raised very early on is, and this will play out not in the U.S. Bill of Rights, but in the U.S. Constitution, is a protest against the British king dispensing with law or failing to enforce law passed by Parliament. And so this is where you see in the U.S. Constitution the guarantee that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And you see the same language in the state constitutions with the governors, right? So we think of this very much as a separation of powers claim, but the English and the Americans both understood that effectively fair execution of the law is itself a kind of a civil liberty or a kind of a right. So that doesn't translate into the U.S. Constitution. It does translate into lots of the state declarations of rights, particularly the ones that are written at the time of the founding. They'll include this sort of a language. So that's one thing that I think is worth emphasizing. Relatedly, the English Bill of Rights is a guarantee basically against the king and not against Parliament. Whereas today, right, it doesn't matter. The president can't violate the First Amendment. Congress can't violate the First Amendment. Eventually, through the 14th Amendment, the states can't violate the First Amendment. But the English Bill of Rights is fundamentally a set of guarantees that are agreed to by the king and that Parliament can modify. Right? Again, remember, there is no formal English constitution in the same sense of like you walk over there and you stare at the document with the glowing light, right? Like there are where everybody is sort of agreeing to be bound by it in the same way. The English Constitution, so to speak, is a set of super important agreement and parliamentary statutes, but they're not binding, they're not unchangeable in the same sense. So just as a clear example of this, England obviously has very aggressive gun control laws. Again, I'm not interested in discussing the merits of gun control laws one way or the other, but they would be probably pretty clearly in tension with the language of the English Bill of Rights if it also applied to Parliament. So Charles III can't go door to door and impose gun control regimes, but under the English understanding of the English Bill of Rights, Parliament certainly can. And so this sort of foreshadows a little bit of the way that psychologically, the Americans and the English understand this revolution differently. That yes, the Americans aren't stupid. They understand that officially this is guarantees against Parliament, or excuse me, against the king. But functionally, they understand these as increasingly sort of substantive, fundamental, foundational rights that ought to be held and guaranteed, regardless of the government institution that's imposing it. So again, that we sort of lose that in the way that we think of the U.S. Bill of Rights as this is just a set of individual rights guarantees, because we've basically decided to say these are actually individual rights. This isn't basically something we're just concerned about the king overreaching on. So some of the language in terms of what's guaranteed is pretty similar. The language against cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment and in the state constitutions is more or less word for word from the English Declarations of Rights. There's a protest against quartering soldiers, which obviously becomes a big deal in the American Revolution. Although strikingly, the quartering soldiers language is not as explicit as a prohibition in the same way in the sort of and therefore section of it. There is a protest against, and again, this goes back to separation of powers, raising a standing army, but importantly, without the consent of Parliament. So Parliament can do this, which then that actually translates to standing armies in the US Constitution with the 2-year congressional appropriation. And one that I think is really striking, and then there's, again, some of the others, there's a restriction on the ability of the king to restrict. There's a restriction on the ability of the king to restrict arms, which is to say there's basically sort of restriction, gun rights provisions of sorts. But they're restricted only to Protestants being applicable. And they also have the caveat saying, except such restrictions as allowed by law, basically, which again leaves a lot of leeway for parliaments to do it in a way that the Americans in both their state and their federal constitution have held this to be a more individual right. But I think one thing that's really, really striking and illustrates just this fundamental difference in some ways, there is no sort of freestanding right of freedom of speech in the English Bill of Rights. There is a freedom of speech and sort of debate within Parliament. So in some sense, it's a protection of Parliament basically talking and critiquing the king. And there is a protection of the right to petition the king. So there's a protection of the right to basically protest, hey, king, fix this. Hey, king, work on this. Hey, don't do this. But strictly speaking, that doesn't have quite the same sort of, and a protection of the right to speak in general, or even necessarily to speak against Parliament, potentially if you wanted to be really strict about it. So really the English Bill of Rights sets up the strong prohibition against sort of an autocratic monarch. And it creates the idea of a set of rights that are held to be really important, that they sort of assume Parliament will protect, but that the rights in the English Bill of Rights themselves don't actually apply against Parliament. Which again, you can see how this, as we've seen it again and again, is part of why sort of the logic of the American Revolution very much are these sort of foundational rights that are sort of always applying. And the main thing is that we want to protect sort of local and divided and decentralized government. Or is this really basically specifically just against a monarch? And the English Bill of Rights very much tilts in the latter direction of being really skeptical of monarchical power, much more comfortable with parliamentary power. And that just fundamentally doesn't translate over to the American context, even as the list of rights that they think are important has a lot of continuity.
So in the English Bill of Rights, they're looking at protecting themselves from the king. Whereas like when you look at, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, but it doesn't talk about the president. Does that matter? That it's not specifically naming a president?
So, yeah, you're right. Fundamentally, the English Bill of Rights is, as you said, fundamentally about checking the king, checking the monarch. Whereas the American one is Congress shall make no law, because Congress is the one making the laws, but the executive is then supposed to be enforcing it, right? So if the executive is enforcing a law that is inconsistent with the First Amendment, presumably it's Congress's problem in the first place. Or if the president is implementing a law that's exceeding that, they're probably being unfaithful if Congress hasn't done it. So they put the Congress language in there primarily because they're assuming that Congress is going to be doing basically, we've again lost the sense of this in today's. We're not nearly as strict about separation of powers as they were. But yeah, they're much more fundamentally concerned that the legislature can do wrong. They think that, in fact, and this is We're going to have a lot of sessions on Madison, right? Madison is concerned that majorities of even elected people, whether that's because of passions of the voters or temporary panic or sort of log rolling cabals of one group against another, the American system is much more skeptical that the government itself, especially the federal government, but the states' governments as well, that the government itself, if elected, that the elected people will themselves make violations of civil liberties. The British understanding is a little bit more that as long as we have elections, that is the fundamental civil liberty. That if we elect the people, Parliament will not break our civil liberties. The Americans are not quite so optimistic about that.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think that is a very concise answer to, I mean, there are definitely ways that the English Bill of Rights has influenced our Bill of Rights, but then there's also some really key differences. Dr. Beienberg, as always, thank you so much.
Yep, my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.